Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our Talks with Walt, as we are calling our readings through the deathbed edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We are now in Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, Part 1, Section number 1 of 9 sections of this classic poem. Now, some have called this poem Whitman's greatest poem. Some have called it an amazing spiritual drama, with Walt Whitman on the one hand and all of the physical world on the other, the tension between the two. Think about the power of the idea of crossings and the idea that you move from one to the other. We have already commented on the fact that for Whitman, one of the key words of our reading of Leaves of Grass is the word progress, and obviously we're playing that game here with this idea of crossings. Now, the assumption for us is that you have been involved with our study here from the beginning, at least that's our hope, at learnstrong.net, down that left-hand side, Talks with Walt, the title of our playlist. And I hope that you've got your own copy of Leaves of Grass, and I hope that you're just annotating it all over the place, starting with inscriptions all the way through and including our Song of the Open Road study, and a set of comments that were kind of introductory to our study of Crossing Brooklyn Ferry. Now, as we get ready to read Section 1 here, I want to go back in time, if I can. And I want to take us to a couple of places. First of all, I want to remind us that in Song of the Open Road Part 3, Whitman actually used this phrase, "You gray stones of interminable pavements, you trodden crossings." And so this word crossing is already kind of a little bit of an echo. But I want to take you really quickly to Song of Myself, Passage 4. And I'm going to argue that a whole lot of what's happening in Crossing Brooklyn Ferry is actually predicted for us in Passage 4 of Song of Myself. Now, we played the same game when we were messing around with other passages in Leaves of Grass, because I think it's one of the central passages of all of Leaves of Grass. He begins, "Trippers and askers surround me." We're going to get to all the people who surround him on the ferry. "People I meet, the effect upon me of my early life, or the ward and city I live in, or the nation." We're going to celebrate, obviously, the city, especially one part of that city in Brooklyn. "The latest dates, discoveries, innovations, societies, authors old and new, my dinner, dress, associates, looks, compliments, dues." We're going to hear about dress and costuming right away. That's why we'll consider it often a drama ferry. "The real or fancied indifferences of some man or woman I love, the sickness of one of my folks or of myself, or ill-doing, or loss of lack of money, or depressions, or exaltations." We're going to hear about all of the bad as well as the good in the poem Ferry. "Battles, the horrors of fratricidal war, the fever of doubtful news, the fitful events." Obviously, we're thinking as well for Whitman of the great contest of the states, the Civil War. "These," he says, "all of this stuff, come to me days and nights and go from me again. But they are not the me myself," this capital M, me. "Apart from the pulling and hauling stands what I am. Stands, amused, complacent, compassionating, idle, unitary, looks down, is erect, or bends an arm, or an impalpable certain rest, looking with side-curved head, curious what will come next, both in and out of the game, and watching, and wondering at it. Backward I see in my own days where I sweated through fog with linguists and contenders. I have no mockings or arguments. I witness and wait." I think this is a crucial set of lines to prepare us for the reading of Section 1 of Crossing Brooklyn Ferry. "Flood tide below me, I see you face to face. Clouds of the west, sun there half an hour high, I see you also face to face. Crowds of men and women attired in the usual costumes, how curious you are to me. On the ferry boats, the hundreds and hundreds that cross, returning home, are more curious to me than you suppose. And you shall cross from shore to shore years hence, or more to me, and more in my meditations than you might suppose." Now, this is going to be interesting for us right away, where he begins. Notice he'll begin with water. Go back to our study of Song of Myself, passage 46, 47. On water and on land, he will say there. And those are two of the predominant word pictures of all of Leaves of Grass. We'll begin with this idea of flood tide below me. Now, he's either on the ferry already, or he's waiting to get on the ferry, and he's watching the ferry arriving, and he will begin to talk about placement. Think about how propositions these prepositions are going to matter all the way through Leaves of Grass. And as we said it in our study of Song of Myself, we're going to say it here as well. So notice, we'll begin. It's below me. You know, he's looking at the water. But he will say it. I see you face to face. Now, only one other time will he use this face-to-face construction outside of Brooklyn Ferry. He's going to do it over the Carnage, and we'll get there when we study that poem. Clouds of the West, and of course we've already talked about the importance of the West in Leaves of Grass, and then notice the dash to look a lot like Emily Dickinson. Sun there half an hour high, dash, I see you also face to face. Notice the use of the word you. It's going to be an intimate poem. That is to say, he will speak both to the elements as well as to the reader, as well as to the participants of the poem, all as you. Beginning, of course, with the word crowds. Crowds of men and women, attired, again, clothing matters to Whitman as we were reading earlier. Attired in the usual costumes. It's an interesting word. He doesn't say garments, he says costumes. Why? Because I think Whitman felt like when he went out for his walks in the city, it was as if he was part of a large drama. He'll say this several times in Leaves of Grass. And he's one of the players. He's one of the participants in this famous poem, this famous play, this famous drama. He will say in another place that you can write a verse and contribute, right? How curious you are to me. Notice already the exclamation points, the end of the first line, and now as well. This word curious, again, as we just read it, so central. I think that is, for me, the central word of Leaves of Grass. Although I know I've said a whole lot of words are central. But to me it is. It's this curiosity. It's this wonder. It's this awe. It's this inspired awe that Whitman has about everything. Think about the ways that our lives become so commonplace. That the most common of activities could be awe-inspiring if only we could capture that curiosity again. The way, think about it, the way a child can be so curious about a dandelion and can play with it and just be blown away by it at the park, right? This is Whitman. I'm so curious about you, and I'm very intrigued. On the ferry boats, the hundreds and hundreds, earlier it was crowds. The idea here, again, sociologically, there's so many people that cross, of course, this word cross is going to be an important word for us. Cross, returning home. We've already commented on how he uses the word home throughout Leaves of Grass. Are more curious, it's an interesting construction, are more curious to me than you suppose. It's a construction we're going to hear repeated in a second. In other words, I'm more interested in you than you might be interested in you, he says. I'm more interested in who you are and what we are together and how fascinating it is. I'm so curious about all of that. It just kind of blows my mind, he says, on the ferry boats. And you that shall cross. Now this is where this poem already gets very, very interesting. Because somehow, even though nobody would really give Whitman the time of day in regards to his Leaves of Grass, it did not sell, it did not make him the amount of wealth that he had hoped that it would make. He did not get the level of reviews that he had hoped he would get, although obviously his review by Emerson helped him tremendously. But somehow, Whitman had this unbelievable optimism, right? I mean, he loved that line from Tintern Abbey, Wordsworth, Tintern Abbey, and so I dare to hope, though change no doubt from what I was when first I came. This idea of daring to hope, this idea of optimism. He somehow knew that you and I would be reading these words together in our talks with Walt. And it's one of the reasons that we've called this archive set Talks with Walt, Conversations. Look at how he talks specifically to you. On the ferry boats, the hundreds and hundreds that cross returning home are more curious to me than you suppose. And you, he says, shall cross from shore to shore, years hence. Right? That idea that he's writing to the people who are not yet even born. We're going to come back to this several times in this poem. And he says, you that shall cross from shore to shore years hence are more to me and more to my meditations than you might suppose. Now, this years hence is exclusive to this poem. We're going to hear it a number of times. This ability to look forward and to somehow project. I know that there will be people long after me who will be a part of what it is that I'm doing right now. And I'm very intrigued by those people. Now, of course, as we read a text like this, we have this tendency to say, so Whitman kind of knew that I was going to be interested in what he had to say, and so he will speak directly to me. Of course, all of us are crossing all the time from shore to to shore. Our whole life is, of course, understood as a crossing. And of course, poets had been using this. Obviously, Tennyson, Crossing the Bar comes to mind. There's a whole series of poets that have utilized this idea of either wading out into water to cross or getting on some kind of craft and going across to be able to kind of use that as the metaphor of what life is all about and how we go from one place to another place, how we go from one idea to another idea. And of course, in the movement of that, we're obviously somehow transcending time and place, which is a concept we're going to get to, obviously, a whole bunch of times in this one. And you that shall cross from shore to shore years hence are more to me and more in my meditations. Again, the fact that he would use the term meditations makes us immediately think of Marcus Aurelius. And in some ways, I don't think I've said this in this series of talks yet, but I think it's probably true now that I'm ready to say it to you. I think that standing behind a whole bunch of leaves of grass is what Whitman understood about Marcus Aurelius' notes to himself, right? That is to say, his meditations. And so he calls what he's doing here a meditation. Another way to think about that, obviously, is a prayer, or, we're contemplating. Then you might suppose. By the way, this word meditations only gets used one other time in Song for Occupations, passage number 5. So as we finish now what kind of is an introductory set of lines, just like at the beginning of Song of the Open Road was kind of an introductory set of lines. Where are we? Well, we are ready to get on the ferry, or we are on the ferry, and we're already commenting on the number of people that are there and the number of people that will do it. In other words, he is writing to the people, to the readers, to the poets that will come, to quote from an earlier poem. At 2a, what are we going to say about themes, messages here? Well, I think what we could argue is that he's saying that the true artist, the true liver of life, is always curious, always watching and waiting, always interested, right? And therein lies the proper attitude, I think, to be a good reader. Mortimer Adler said this in his arguments on how to read a book. Harold Bloom said the same thing. You've got to approach texts with a level of curiosity, not skepticism, not rage, not, oh, this is going to be garbage, but rather pick it up to say, what can I learn here? What is there here for me? And I think the artist, for Whitman, the poet, is always about that. At 2b, not what he says, but how he says it, notice all these repetitions. The word curious, the word more, you might suppose, repeated. In other words, there's a certain kind of melodic lilt to Brooklyn Ferry that's, of course, not absent in other parts of Leaves of Grass, but many have argued that it's more beautiful, that this is a poem that's worthy to be read out loud. There are, in fact, those of us who love to read this poem out loud. They're at the very locations in New York, next to the Brooklyn Bridge, because there's some kind of precious lilting quality to all of these lines of poetry. At 3a, well, think about all the classic crossing texts, as we've said already. That is to say, think about all those classic texts that always want to talk about boats. They always want to talk about bodies of water and rivers. They always want to talk about journeys and going across them and the ways in which all of that will matter, right? Of course, we have to think about Dante and his taking that trip with Virgil across the river, no question. And as we mentioned, Marcus Aurelius' Meditations. That will start, as we give in lectures elsewhere at learnstrong.net, on Marcus Aurelius and his Meditations. That will start with what? Well, attribution. Thank you. Who? People. People in his life who were significant. Here, notice it's going to be crowds of men and women, and it's going to be you that will already be kind of gestured at. Finally, how are we going to own a section 1 poem like this? Well, I think it's a fair question to ask. Do you consider yourself a curious seeker of new knowledge? We've said the new is the new, the NEW is the KNEW. Are you a curious seeker of new knowledge? Is that how you approach your life? Is that how you approach this reading now of Brooklyn Ferry? You'll remember those final lines of the great Longfellow poem, right? Psalm of Life. Let us then be up and doing with a heart for any fate, still achieving, still pursuing, learn to labor and to wait. Are you that individual, or for you, do you struggle with curiosity? Maybe you've come to a point in your life where you're just like, it's all boring. Whitman just could never get there. He's just so fascinated by life. Are you curious, we might ask it this way, to cross with Walt? I hope you'll come back. We'll go to passage 2 in our Crossing with Walt. Thank you.